I'm going to talk about aspects of mapping the geography of religion, different religious traditions in China and Tibet. And it does sort of wander around all over China and crossing disciplines. And the reason for that is it comes out of several recent projects Drew was talking about. One was the Himalayan Historical Geographic Information System project that I'm working on with a colleague at the University of Virginia, and also the Atlas of China Religions project that the ECAI up at Berkeley been working on for several years. And we have a website with Academy Center in Taiwan showing first some of the data. Now, first looking at some of the results of my the grant Drew was talking about, the National Science Foundation grant I'm looking at changing Muslim settlement patterns in China and the changing geography of this. Some of the general results are presented here with the graph and the map. And we're reapplying to try to extend the survey to all of India and Nigeria. And so that's what we're hoping to get extended for the next 3 years. Now, what we have here is a map of China during the Qing period. And for those in China studies, what's been a very influential sort of geographical model of China was the economic anthropologist, the late G.W. Skinner, was at Stanford and then Davis. This is his macro-regional systems model of China, that the argument that there were these core areas, shown here in dark, where dependency on the market was the most intense, where there was more capital investment and less people involved in agricultural activities. And then there were these peripheral areas that were more largely agrarian, and all of the major marketing and trading patterns were sort of dictated by the cities in the core. And actually, as I extend this research to Tibet, as I'll show in a little bit, I largely disagree with some of this, and I've been sort of remapping it. But what is interesting about looking at here, Islam, for example, is that we're looking at the founding of mosques by dates of founding from a volume surveying more than 1,000 mosques in China, a fairly good data set that we worked with. And that early on, from the Tang and the Song period, most of the mosques seem to have been founded in these economic core regions of China. And as we get into the Qing period and into the Republican period, it switches. You start to have more of a growth of the mosques, and the mosques sort of would be a proxy for Muslim communities and the growth of these local cultural areas, because we don't have good historical census data in the sense of being able to map ethnic groups or religious groups historically consistently. We have data, but nothing like a modern census. And so religious sites are useful for mapping out where the believers most likely have the largest concentrations. Now, one of the arguments, though, of Skinner's regional systems model of China was that it followed watershed boundaries, that the cores and the peripheries. But what I question about that, though, is that, well, in that case, why doesn't the Northwest China macro region go completely up the Yellow River Valley, Yellow River watershed, or the Yangtze watershed? In other words, once the Tibetan plateau was hit, Skinner's macro regional systems model of China just sort of ends, and it was only meant to really apply to China proper. But I believe that some of these principles of economic core and peripheral areas can be extended to all of Central Asia. It doesn't have to be limited to China. Now, this leads me to some areas that interest me a lot in my research, is world system history and religion. And there are some interesting questions that I'm addressing here. One is, well, how to map or study what were sort of historically, economically autonomous sections of the world system before the global capitalist economy created sort of one system that we're sort of stuck living with today. This would be like the work of Braudel. Skinner's work on China looks at how to do this. Another is then in this research on the historical geography of Islam. One interesting question then would be how to model the world system during the political and cultural peak of Muslims in the 1500s and 1600s, before the European-based global capitalist system sort of colonized most of the Arab and Middle Eastern regions. Now that would be very interesting for me to do too in the future. Another is how to model changes then wrought by the growth of the modern capitalist world system. And one reason then that I'm interested in mapping religious sites like Buddhist temples, mosques, and so forth, is that the growth and spread of religious establishments are indicators of economic development in many ways. If we map hundreds and hundreds of sites across vast regions, you have to have had enough wealth in an area for people to have built all these temples. And if you don't have a lot of temples or mosques built out in remote desert areas, you have more in the richer core regions than in some cases. But this is what we need to map these out and study the patterns, because as I just saw from the previous slide, but in these peripheral areas of China into the Qing period, there started to seem to have been many more mosques built. One argument could be that the global capitalist economy coming into China, like the price of wool increased, or even if the price of wool maybe hadn't increased over relative prices in previous dynastic periods, the demand from Western exporters for, let's say, wool in the port city of Tianjin, for example, could have been such that there was more New World silver and more of a demand for extending capital circuits and so forth. Maybe Chinese Muslims or Tibetan traders and so forth were benefiting from this. And this is something that often isn't looked at in mapping the growth of religious sites and so forth, is what were perhaps economic reasons behind it. Now, I'm going to focus on the Northeastern Tibetan, Northwest China cultural interface, largely in some ways sort of a Tibetan Buddhist, mixed Han Chinese Muslim interface in this part of Northwest China, where I have from very, very good spatial data sets, and I've been able to do some of the spatial modeling that I want to present to you, because it's too data intensive, time intensive to do it for the whole world. I mean, I can do it for one region and then slowly build up the data. Now, here's a map from 1939, very well-known missionary scholar, Robert Ekval, who lived in the Tibetan frontier of Republican China. Very well-known among Tibetan specialists for his writings and diaries and insights of life from the time. But what's interesting about his work, Cultural Relations on the Gansu-Tibetan Border, is that note that for his work, looking at, let's say, the Chinese side, the location of Chinese and Muslims, compared to the Tibetan side, the sedentary and the nomadic Tibetans, and this was largely, he was looking at the wool trade, where many of the Chinese Muslims sort of served as middlemen, going into the Tibetan areas, getting the wool, bringing it in deeper into parts of China to sell at a profit. Is that notice that the cultural relations are often defined in terms of economic trade patterns between different religious groups. And that's sort of the core of the definition of the cultural relations, was these sort of economic relations between different religious groups, which I find sort of interesting. Now, what's the regional socioeconomic systems? Well, this was pioneered by the late anthropologist G.W. Skinner in his regional systems model of China. Regional socioeconomic systems are what's just often referred to as regional systems approach. It's a very data-intensive way using GIS to model major socioeconomic patterns. And the classic approach, I'll just read to you a blurb from Schramm, another missionary who lived a very long time in this part of the world and wrote sort of one of the seminal studies on one of the ethnic groups of this region. But his writings are so detailed that you can find evidence for both approaches in different aspects of his writing. But let's just look at the first one, which is sort of the classic regional systems approach. Here he says, indeed, the economic conditions of the whole country improved only when the Qing dynasty secured peace, which would have been in Amdo in northeastern Tibet, this would have been after the sort of unsuccessful Tibetan revolt of 1723. After that, the Qing really moved in and clamped down on the region. And this improvement depended on the vitality of commerce, right? He says here, no trade of real importance had been able to coexist with insecurity on the roads, since trade required normal and regular transportation facilities and a safe access to the outlets of commerce. For the center of a developing economy, a city is required. See, this is the key to a regional systems approach, is that all of the core areas are developed around cities. In this case, the city was Xining, the capital of Qinghai province, with its group of professional merchants from all over China associated in guilds according to the Chinese custom. Okay, well, here's an alternative approach, which my research on mapping out the Tibetan monasteries of the region and the mosques and the Chinese market towns as of the Qing period leads me to take a little more seriously. Here, the alternate approach would be here, the interest of the subjects was centered only on the monastery. This is mainly speaking of the ethnic Tibetan population. There was no need for them to go to the city, since the necessities of life could be secured at the monastery fairs. And nobody cared for the Chinese officials, the lamas being their legal officials. Many, many people had never seen or entered a city. The monasteries and their subjects lived their own life, in their own orbit, alien to the city, just as if the Chinese officials did not exist. And if we look at some of these historic photos from the early 20th century of some of these monastic fairs, trade fairs, which might have been held a certain day of each month. Some of the larger monasteries, like this is probably Labrang Monastery in Gansu province. Someone could check if they took the time to compare some of these historic buildings. I couldn't find on the photo which, but I'm guessing it was probably Labrang or another one in the region of Gansu. Look at the number of traders who set up their stalls. There are a lot of course, monks that are shopping for things. And some of these monastic fairs were held all year long. I mean, some in parts of Tibet, like there were, of course, the larger places like Lhasa had their own sort of bazaars and things going on every day. But in some of these regions, it might have been one day a month, or some monasteries had fairs every month for 5 days, 10 days. And here's a Kumbho Monastery, the famous row of the 8 Chorten, or the 8 stupa in front of the famous monastery near the site of the birthplace of Jungpa, the founder of the Gelugpa sect of Tibetan Buddhism. Look at this fair. This seems to be a lot of
And the Dalai Lama.
Yeah, right. The Dalai Lama was the head of that sect, of course, of Tibetan
He was
Buddhism.
born there as well.
Right. And the present 14th Dalai Lama was born about 10 miles from here in a little village. But this seems to be a lot of hay and fodder. That's, quite a lot of economic activity going on at these fairs. And the regional systems model for agrarian China, the problem with it is if we looked at those earlier maps I was showing, the assumption of the model sort of was that the periphery just ended when ethnic Tibetan and ethnic Mongol areas was reached. And my argument would be that there was no sort of economic no man's land. Instead of having cities and towns doing where a lot of the commerce and trading was going on, it was the monastery, the monastic fairs of the Tibetan and Mongol Buddhist monasteries that served the roles of the towns. Okay, and of course, the Muslims in the region, one interesting aspect I noticed that I wanted just to point out here was the burning of incense, or the sticking of incense by the Hui at the shrines of the various Sufi saints. And that's very interesting, the burning of the incense, of the offering of the incense. And, I think that there's some, Drew, is it possible that was influence from the Buddhists historically that the Muslims in this region picked up. All right, so here's my first map from the data that is very complicated. I want to take a few minutes to sort of show you what it is that we're looking at here. And then I'll go through some of the actual analytical techniques I ran on the data and look at some specific maps. Well, here we have trade and religious fairs of Amdo, Northeastern Tibet, as of about 1900. Each of the monasteries with a fair is shown here. The monastery with only 1 to 2 fairs through the year, following the lunar calendar, or the agrarian calendar. So if the historical record said the monastery held the fair on the 15th day of the 3rd month, that would be more like April. It's not based on the Western solar calendar. These were mostly agrarian calendar dates. But we have monasteries that had 1 to 2, up to 10 to 13. The most fairs held at a Buddhist monastery in this region was 13. So that would be having about 1 fair a month, a fair lasting up to about 2 weeks. And during these fairs, there were also prayer services going on. And so someone might argue that this was a religious festival. But even if it was primarily a religious festival for the prayers and the offerings, there were so many traders who came and set up shop and set up their stalls, and people who came for the religious services then could go ahead and buy what they needed to buy. That's why I call them sort of trade religious fairs. Here we have the few cities which would have been a provincial capital, a prefectural or a county capital under the Qing dynasty system, which would have been places like Lanzhou, Lanzhou and Xining, and then deeper into China proper you'd have a few more, but it's mainly the towns, which is coming. I edited the town layer from the China Historical GIS based at Harvard, but the problem with their town layer, these small white circles, which I apologize don't show up that clearly, but the problem is that it's an unedited layer. They show all of these so-called towns as of 1820, but if you look at the names, about 50% of the so-called towns were actually the names of the Buddhist monastery, which I already had in my database. And so I had to delete those out. And so I'm left with what really would have been a Chinese market town. And this pattern sort of shows that where you have, and I'll show this more with some statistical results, where you had more of the actual towns and urban centers, that you tended to have less of the monastic fairs. And I apologize, the only digital GIS map I had of Skinner's core and peripheries was a 1990 version, based on China's 1990 census, which had 14 zones. I went ahead and put it, I only recently got from his RA what he was using for the Qing dynasty database, and I didn't have time to put that in the background. But there isn't much of a change. The only core area, according to Skinner, even in the Qing period, was based on Lanzhou in this part of Northwest China. All right, and if we look at, though, historically, I think time is often not taken into account. Here's an example of one of my introductory maps from the Historical Atlas of Tibet that I'm making now for the University of Chicago Press. And given the great east to west extension of the Tibetan Plateau, it's designed so that the spine, the gutter of the book will go right down the 90 degrees. So people can open up a normal sized book and still have a nice map covering the whole region. But this is travel time from Lhasa in weekly increments, an average daily rate of 12 miles a day. And it doesn't really matter if you do it on foot or if you have pack animals, because even if you have pack animals, you have to stop and graze them. You have to give the animals time to graze. You can't go for 12, 15 hours a day for weeks on end. The animals will just die on you. So walking, now of course officials who had access to the official relay stations, of course, could do much better time than 12 miles a day. You have historical couriers and officials who were able to do something like 50 miles a day. But that was exceptional. Those were official riders. The average people were doing about 12 miles a day, which is interesting. So if you look at Lhasa, in a month from Lhasa, you could only get to about here on the borders of the historical East Kampa Kingdom of Derge, for example. 2 months took you still hardly barely to anywhere in an ethnically Chinese area. It basically took more like 3 months basically to get into what we would call China proper. And that's just so fascinating, the amount of time that it took to travel. So if one way to try to look at what is closest to areas before using a more sophisticated technique I developed, the most easiest way to do it is buffering. A buffer zone is where someone says, I'm going to take points, like in this case, I'm taking the mosques of this part of Northwest China, Northeastern Tibet, and I'm buffering them at 6 miles. Why 6 miles? Well, if someone was going to, where would they be able to walk to be active within a day? If you went out about 6 miles, you could still get home within the same day. So, but the problem with buffering is that you have arbitrary boundaries. You might say, well, why 6 miles? Why not 7 miles? Why not 7.2 miles? You get into this endless debate with people, and so that's why I moved on to networks. Networks are a much more better way to do this, but it's much more complicated. That's the problem. But buffering is easy to do with ArcGIS, ArcMap. If you have your points, you can easily, you can click a couple buttons and you can have your buffers. And then you can ask a question such as, well, how many monastic fairs were within 1 day's round-trip travel time of these mosques, or something like that. And we get like a 41%. And that could be meaningful. But the problem is it's arbitrary. If I switched it to a 10-mile buffer or a 2-mile buffer, this percentage would change. And that's the problem with buffering. So what I did here is I worked out a program to do nearest neighbor arcs, which, believe it or not, there's no button that you can push in ArcGIS or a desktop GIS which will take points, in this case all of the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and Chinese market towns, and that will automatically put in a straight line that you can use to measure the distance to the nearest neighbor. Of course, the nearest neighbor would be points that I have predetermined, that are in my data set. It's not going to go out and find nearest neighbors for points that are not in my data set. So the trick here is you want to have a very, very rich, all-inclusive data set. You want to be sure to go through the historical records and the survey volumes and get all the known Buddhist monasteries, all the known mosques. And the problem with that is that takes years of time. I've spent years now, literally I've spent 10 years just building up my databases and hardly publishing anything. Because it takes so many years to build up these really good databases to work with. So here we have the nearest neighbor arcs in red, contemporary province boundaries for reference in black, Gansu province, Qinghai province, prefecture boundaries for reference as well. The black dots, Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, the Chinese towns, and these are as of 1820. I should point out that I'm looking at as of the mid-Qing period, the Chinese market towns as of the 1820 data set. And what we can do then is we can start to do things like this. Like here's a focus on what the Tibetans call the Zhongka region of Amdo, or Zhongka meaning onion, the land of onions, Zhongka Pa, the famous Lama born in the 1300s, referred to as, in a sense, the man from onion land, I guess you could say. So this valley of Xining, this region down to the lower Yellow River, when it's still in Amdo, is referred to as Zhongka, or Huangnan in Chinese. Well, there are 7 cities in the study area as of 1820. 5 were not nearest to a monastery with a fair at all. Only 28% were nearest. And of the 70 market towns, 52 were not nearest to a monastery with a fair. They were nearest to either another market town or a monastery that had no trade fair. So my argument would be that if a monastery was very close to a Chinese market town, it had no sort of incentive to have the religious festival, because there wouldn't have been the traders coming and the people coming to buy stuff, which would have sort of fueled people coming for the religious services. Now, that's not completely true, but why is it then that only 26% of the market towns are nearest to a monastery that had a trade fair? And, well, one reason could also be that the Chinese market towns were in these lower sort of double cropping agricultural area. The double cropping area would be more favorable environmental conditions or reasonable temperatures. This would be up to about 2,500 meters, up to about 8,000 feet roughly above sea level. And this is where mostly all of the market towns are largely based, though as you get out around the Qinghai, the lake, and the westward southern branch of the Silk Road, there was a lot of trade and reasons for some market towns going out that way too. Now, if we look at here, the Brong region, and this is very interesting, and I've only begun to start to analyze a lot of this data, is that what's referred to as the Gannan Tibetan Autonomous Region of Gansu Province. I was always struck in the data, which is why is it that the monasteries here just have so many more trade fairs on average than the monasteries in the Qinghai part of Amdo? Well, of course, you have the Gansu data that we were working with, maybe it was just better quality data than the Qinghai data. That's possible. But then, notice though that the elevation, it's all in the highland mixed agricultural pastoral. It's all relatively higher. And during the Qing period, the only market towns there was a few over here by Choni, Lintan, Taozhou, these areas. But generally, there were just no market towns. I mean, even if you looking at the old maps from the Qing period, contemporary data that works with this stuff, there just were no Chinese market towns. And so that's interesting. That's one reason possible that these monasteries had to have more trade fairs, almost one a month, because they had all of these people, in their areas that needed to, buy stuff, and they needed a fair, once a month or so. So, future research then would be this. You see, the problem with the program that I worked on with a colleague of mine, who's a very good GIS programmer, and he used Python to do the program. But once the program is done, it would be possible to, we could put it on a website or something, and people could just download it, and as long as they had any georeference points for anywhere in the world, and they had it in a shapefile format, they could, it would be pretty easy to get someone knowledgeable to take 20 minutes and run the program and create this type of shapefile coverage that they could then work with in their research. But the future research here would be, if we only connect all of the monasteries or towns or mosques of a part of China or whatever part of the world you're working on with the nearest neighbor, it's quite sort of weird. You get these groupings of places that were near to each other but farther from other groupings. And so that would be interesting. You might look at, well, were there certain religious traditions or ethnic patterns or something that might have resulted from people being just nearer to each other. That has a lot to do with human interaction. But there's a need now to then add in an extra arc, which would basically be from each grouping of nearest neighbors, like take this grouping and this grouping, it would be logical then to write a new program that would just add an arc, and then add an arc. And then all of the points would be connected up for, let's say, all of China, or all of, with all of Central Asia. And it would be possible to pick the time period, like I'm interested in the Ming Dynasty, or the Qing period, or contemporary period. And then you can do more traditional GIS network analysis, as it's called. I mean, a lot of people do GIS network analysis every day. Like people who work at, FedEx and UPS, they're constantly looking for what's the shortest delivery route. If I have these 12 places I have to deliver packages to, which ones should I hit first? And that network analysis is being done a lot. But in the social science academic research, what I find fascinating is you can find countless articles with the network in the title. like I'm doing a network analysis. So, you know, I'm looking at these networks. But if you look at what is a GIS network, it's something completely different. It's basically you have to have an arc that connects up points, and so that you can really run a lot of specific modeling routines and algorithms on the data that you have, right? And so that's what I was looking at here. So if we look at historical GIS evolution, and this is from Brian Berry, a well-known GIS specialist in the field, sort of one of the pioneers of GIS. I just copied this from one of his websites. But we had manual mapping for about 8,000 years. And then computer mapping automates the geographic process in the 70s. In the 1980s, then, we started to have spatial database management, where we could link computer mapping techniques with traditional database capabilities, which would be like, I want to click on this point and get the name of it to pop up, right? In the 1990s, we started to get into real map analysis. You know, the representation of relationships within and among map data. Like that, for example, is what I was doing with my network analysis of Northwest China, Northeastern Tibetan cultural interfaces. I was doing specific map analysis. And then multimedia mapping would be the full integration of GIS internet. And a lot of people are working on that now, but it's largely an unrealized promise, because you can go to Google Earth, or you can easily go online and find digital maps where it allows you to pull up all the points and places that you want, and click on everything that you want and find the names of it, get pictures to pop up. But if you want to do just basic map analysis, if you want to just ask questions such as what places are closest to this place, or how many points are within this polygon, it's still, there's a real lag still in what's being done by most of the academic GIS projects. Most are still really here, you know, in the 70s and 80s. And even though it's 2010, most of the work that's being done is still doing stuff that was sort of commonly done in the 70s and 80s. And getting to having full-blown map analysis online is coming, but it's a very slow process, partly because of the high quality of the data sets, the databases that you need to really make the work possible. Also, I've got about, 10 more minutes or so. I wanted to quickly go through some other research I've been doing on Tibet, and I figure I can quickly go through that in about 10 minutes, since I was a little bit slow with the previous presentation. It's interesting sometimes to just look at a region of the world with a southern perspective. So much of the time we're locked into this northern perspective, and I sort of looking at being influenced here by Brauddel's famous map, and Brauddel's well-known work on the Mediterranean. And we had this map in the front of the book showing the Mediterranean world facing south, to sort of show how large North Africa was. And I think this sort of shows how so much of the culture of the Tibetan Plateau, it makes sense that there was so much influence from South Asia. And it's interesting how parts of China proper look less significant, when you look at the Tibetan Plateau with a southern perspective. Though actually a lot of historical Chinese maps have a southern perspective and not a northern perspective. I'm going to look at quickly the decline and fall of the Tibetan Empire and patterns of the early growth of Buddhism in Western Tibet. This is an example of the types of maps in my historical atlas of Tibet, showing here's Tibet at the time of the Tibetan Empire, roughly 600 to 900. Most of the historical record we have for the early Buddhist temples and the first monastery, Samye, are all clustering around Lhasa. And as we get into other parts, the historical records are just not as good. We don't have, also it's possible that most of the early Buddhist sites, temples were just built in this area around Lhasa. And there was very little going on except along the major trade route to Kashmir and the major trade routes down to what would have been the Pala Empire of Pala, India. One thing I found interesting in mapping out different types of cultural, historical sites in the atlas. And I wasn't even thinking about this until I mapped it out, which is what's so useful about mapping out the data, is that it just leads you in new research directions that you never would have thought of. Is that a lot of the burial mounds, because into the Tibetan Empire period, the royalty and the nobility were still burying their dead in very large burial mounds, just like the Tang Dynasty China was doing, is that they occupy distinct zones from the area of the Buddhist temples. If you look at areas where a lot of the necropoli are, they tend to be areas where you don't have the early Buddhist temples that were built. And I'm not, to what extent is this just the data, we don't have complete data, or is this a meaningful pattern? Here, for example, 3 large burial mounds in central Tibet, Galkartong, in present Chusan County. These are quite far away in the distance. Here's some sheep grazing. So you can see the scale of these. And they're actually all over central Tibet. I think a lot of tourists just assumed that there was the famous Emperor Songtse-Gampo was buried, there was the Valley of the Kings, and that this was sort of where all the burial mounds were located, but that's not the case. They're all over the place. And here's a picture of the first monastery, and one interesting thing would be, well, to what extent were they sort of competing? The indigenous religion that some may have said it was sort of an early form of Bön, like the Bunbo, or what it meant at the time of the empire was that these were reciters or priests who buried the dead and watched over the sites and so forth. Were they competing for space and grazing land? Notice that with so many areas that would have been, would these early burial valleys have been like sacred valleys of the dead to the nobility and the royalty, and would they have been sort of off limits to people grazing livestock or to expansion of Buddhist temples and questions like this? As we move over to the key formative period in Tibetan history, though, is referred to as the Cheetah, the second diffusion of Buddhism. This is when the great different sectarian traditions like the Nyingma, the Kadampa, the Kagyu, the Sakya, some other minor ones really started to get going, and the Bön identified themselves as a specific sectarian affiliation. And areas that had been predominantly burial mounds areas under the Tibetan Empire quickly filled in with Buddhist sites by the Cheetah period. Now, one of the best known sort of recognized texts from this period that's been preserved, though perhaps handed down and copied later, is the Ba Zhe, or the royal narrative concerning the bringing of the Buddhist doctrine to Tibet. And I was really interested in reading this, and I came across some interesting lines here. One is that it says here that the master Padmasambhava, that would be Guru Rinpoche in Tibetan, a very well-known deity, especially of the Nyingma, a tantric Buddhist master from what's now the Swat Valley of Pakistan. But at that time it was largely Buddhist, and he traveled to Tibet and was very well known for asked a lot of Buddhist teachings to Tibet. It says here, afterwards the master of the mantra, Padmasambhava, made a number of suggestions. It said here, the sand of upper and lower Namsho should be transformed into a meadow. Many springs should appear in upper and lower Dra, Dol and Jung, and forth up. And thanks to the fields, the people should have intensive farming activity for their livelihood. The rivers and lakes should be trained and crossed. And in other words, what's interesting is that even though the largely Buddhist texts of Tibet said, well, the whole reason Padmasambhava came was to bring Buddhism, if we're reading one of the only surviving agreed upon sort of evidence of what he actually did, it seems here that the main thing that he was doing was teaching agricultural irrigation. That's what he was doing to the emperors. And would that have been threatening? Because to the Bunbo and to the indigenous religious practitioners, would that have been threatening to some extent? Now, notice here, one of the regions, Dra and Dol. Here is the region of Dra and Dol, which in all of the evidence I mapped from the Tibetan Empire, it was only these necropoli, these burial mounds in that entire area. Then Padma Sambhava comes along, an expert perhaps on irrigation technology from South Asia, trying to help the early Tibetan emperors in building an empire and maybe extending irrigation to these areas, which would have perhaps been sacred to the indigenous burial grounds and practices. So I'm just I'm interested in looking at the history from that perspective, and not simply from a Buddhist perspective. So here, if we look at sort of a traditional Buddhist Tibetan studies thesis as to why the Tibetan Empire collapsed, we have, well, the last emperor persecuted Buddhism. That's very well known. Emperor Wangdharma supposedly persecuted the Buddhists. A monk assassinated the emperor. The slaves revolted, and that fits in very well with sort of a socialist discourse about slaves revolting and these earlier political systems having been unjust and so forth. But also notice here that a period of darkness resulted. I love it the way historians always, when they don't have data for a period, they'll say a period of darkness resulted, and we don't know anything, right? And then Buddhism was reintroduced in the 900s, whereas my thesis would be, okay, population growth pressed against available farmland resources, but areas of worldly burial mounds were too extensive. Food production demands outweighed concern for sacred areas. Burial mound valleys had to be opened up to farming grazing. That's what the little evidence we have about what Padma Sambhava was giving advice to the Tibetan government at the time was that you need to put in irrigation canals and open up more areas to farming. That would have supported more Buddhist monasteries because you would have had more grain butter available. There could have been sort of a domino effect. Thus, you had a growth of the monasteries and so forth. And I'm sure there's, the combination of both of these having truth would be valuable. I just feel that in a lot of the sort of historical explanations, you don't have really good GIS maps and so forth that you can say, pick a time period, analyze what the sites were, pick another time period, analyze what the sites were. I'm doing it on my computer in my office, but I'm very much isolated doing it. It's not easy to get this stuff sort of out there online in a way that a lot of people can use because of just the high cost of hiring the programmers, needing a lot of funding. Certainly among Tibetan farmers, even in largely farming valleys, livestock is always important to have at least some cows. There's always going to be cutting, important to have some source of brushwood, fuel wood here and so if we look at, of course, the reason for pastoralism is the value of the milk, the pastoral products that can be gained from it. Like here's a Tibetan nomad making cheese, drying cheese by his tent. If we look at typical villages in central Tibet, it's striking how trees grow very well. But these are trees that have been protected with walls, largely. They were intentionally protected from livestock nibbling them when they were little shoots. And if we look at what is most of the landscape like, it would have probably during the Neolithic, archaeologists tell me during the Paleolithic, Neolithic, this would have been forested right up to the tree limit of about 14,000 feet, which would be up about here. That this would largely have all been forested. And that we're looking at hundreds and hundreds of years of farming and herding of livestock, which has created sort of a cultural landscape here. So, the evidence, and this is interestingly a Gyalma village in central Tibet, one of the Mongol Yuan period tree core of Wanhu, 10,000 household units. This is actually a section of the 13th century wall, which still survives. And as a side note, what the township did to capitalize on tourism is they bought out the 15 or 20 Tibetan families that had houses in the old walled area, gave them enough money to build houses over here. They rebuilding the entire wall and turning it into a museum theme park of the imperial Tibetan fortress, or something like this, and tourists are going to be busting here from Lhasa to visit the site, and it's still under development. Now, of course, GIS can be an inductive research endeavor, as I've shown. You know, it's not necessarily deductive in that I can look at the results and interpret the results. One of the large criticisms from social theorists of GIS is that somehow people are pushing buttons and getting answers that they want to get, you know. But that's not really true. When you do any type of a GIS analysis, you have to interpret the results. You can't just take the results and say that these are self-evident. You have to interpret them. So whether you're interpreting some type of a discourse from a textual analysis, or you're interpreting your GIS operation results, it's still, in a sense, there's a qualitative aspect to what is largely seen as a quantitative endeavor, right? Certainly, I use here quickly GIS to just say, well, if I extended the tree line, this is in dark green, this is current forest from a global UN FAO 1 kilometer resolution database showing the Himalayas and the forested valleys of the lower elevation Tibetan valleys. But if I use this light green color to run up the tree line in different regions based on what botanists have told me is the tree limit, assuming no human interference, you actually get a forested, largely forested central Tibet, largely forested common Amdo, and it's only this what the Tibetans, what scholars refer to as Zhangzhong, possibly a pre-Buddhist, archaic, prehistorical political entity that we don't really know anything about. But we do have all of the known Bronze to Iron Age stelae, like these, that have been documented. They all cluster in what would be what would have been in the Neolithic, the non-forested part of the plateau, which would have been open to hunting of large livestock, hunting of large game, and herding of livestock too. Introducing herding or just hunting, in these areas. So that's kind of interesting to look at how most of the historical records indicate that it was lost in central Tibet, was sort of the growth of Tibetan civilization. But some specialists and archaeologists now are sort of pushing it back and arguing that there was sort of a pre-Buddhist, prehistorical development of civilization on the plateau, which would be referred to as sort of a Zhangzhong. So, but we don't really know anything about it because whoever these people were, they didn't develop their own writing system, and so there's never, it's not like Egyptology or Sumerology where you have, some historical records to work with. If we look at what were the major powers during the second diffusion of Buddhism period across the plateau, what is clear is that it was in Western Tibet that after the Tibetan Empire collapsed around the Tang period, around 800, 900, it was these kingdoms out here, Gugay, Purang, Ladakh, were quite powerful, took off quite early. And the environment, like the Gugay kingdom, is quite interesting geographically. You basically have the Grand Canyon with the Himalayas above it, and so it's just quite interesting then, why here? Why this region was such a rich cradle for this early development of Buddhism in Tibet and political power. Why did these kingdoms take off here so well, while in central Tibet there never was a return to any unified centralized political system until the fifth Dalai Lama in the 1700s. Toling, founded in 996 AD, the most well-known famous Buddhist monastery in the Gugay region, a big destination of tourists who do like Mount Kailash circumambulation. Toling is often one of the places people visit. Here's a detailed map of the kingdom during the 10th to 14th century, sort of focusing on all of the known religious, largely Buddhist sites and that pattern. There's still a huge amount of sites that haven't been well known. I mean, they haven't been mapped and documented. Like here, for example, several years ago, we were looking up at the remains of this old fort here. Mangnam village and temple down below, fairly well known, but there's a fort. Most of these places had a fort and an acropolis position, and then some type of maybe development in an unguarded area, perhaps when times were more peaceful. But this sort of 12th century temple, surviving Buddhist statue, there's a lot of these around in Western Tibet. There's still a lot of good, mapping documentation that really needs to be done. Here, for example, I was interested in what would have been the potential historical farmland. If we're looking today, one thing that's most striking in this Western Tibetan area is how little farmland there is. And it's not clear if a lot of the abandoned fields, like here, we have two farmers standing in areas that you can see old irrigation canals, old terracing patterns, but it's difficult to say. We can't say that this was all abandoned in the 12th century. How do we know that it wasn't abandoned? This was overworked during the Cultural Revolution, and it led to problems in 1970. And it's different. There are not a lot of specialists with the physical science requirements going and looking at this problem. So all I did was saying that if these farmland areas that had existed at some point in the historical past, we know that 1 grain yields about 3,000 calories, and we know what the grain yields are in this area. A person is now receiving, this would mean based on how many people were in this village, they were receiving about 1,000 calories from grain daily, which makes sense. A person could get another 1,000 or 2,000 from meat. You could eat 5,000 calories just meat alone a day. So these are all sort of arbitrary. You have to look at sort of approximate levels. But the historical potential farmland was such that if we assume that people only got 1,000 calories a day from grain, there could have been 1,300 people in an area that today only has 84 people. Even if we assume that they were getting 3,000 calories each day from grain, which is highly unlikely, there still would have been 433 people compared to 84. And so what interests me is that there's just so little models and data out there to do this in the world. There's so much work that needs to be done to map out current farmland areas, map out what would have been historical potential farmland areas, and so forth. Here, for example, is one of my last slides, a 12th century stupa chorten. Looking up more closely, it was clear that this was from the 12th century. And we know that Tibetans build stupas along the edges of farm fields, and here we have evidence of terracing and irrigation canals. So, certainly this area, there's evidence then that this area was farmed in the Second Diffusion Buddhism period. But the question is, when was so much of this farmland abandoned? Was it abandoned in the 13th century, or the 18th century, or 1970? There's so much work that still needs to be done. And I'm about out of time, so I'd like to take questions from anyone, and thank you for listening so attentively. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so back to the trade fair density and how often they're occurring. Very interesting, and it was very persuasive. But I wondered if you tried standardizing data for population densities.
Well, we don't really know what the population densities were in 1820. We do know the first China's good census was 1982. So 1982, 1990, I could say I know how many Tibetans or Han there were, or Hui, Chinese Muslims, but I can't say that, I can't just automatically project back to the Qing period. So, we could do something with the number of monks, like we know how many monks they had in the Qing period, and then we could make an assumption that all the local families, to have produced that many, to given that many sons to the monastery, there had to have been a certain base population.
Yeah, I suspect, not knowing much about the area, but I suspect it would actually change the map, and my guess, given just the geography, that it would actually enhance your argument. you would actually see, it wouldn't like level out the differences, it might actually make them starker versus the market towns.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think I wanted to at least use current contemporary census data, and there are some scholars who extrapolate backwards.
Right.
They say if we assume a growth rate of 1%, or in the pre-modern time, traditional agrarian economy, supposedly grew about half a percentage point on average over 1,000 years. So, but that would take some time.
Need another RA.
Right, right.
But I wonder if you can say something about Tibetan-Muslim relations based on the historical data of the rise and maybe fall of temples versus mosques, monasteries versus mosques. We know, of course, as recently as the riots of March a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, that Muslims and Tibetans don't belong very well. Most of the people who died during those riots were Muslims.
Shop owners.
Shop owners, Hui, who died, although the press said it was Chinese, most of them were Muslims. And we know that there were many wars fought in the 18th century between Tibetans and Muslims. What we don't know is the earlier history. And what you seem to be suggesting from the location of temples and mosques, that there's a kind of interesting overlap. And that clearly, if you have the data, I don't know if you have the data of market days, you have monastic fairs. Assume Muslims are shopping at the same monastic fairs. The Tibetans are going to go to market days in Linsha or Hezhou,
Right.
as well as Taoba, as well as the Lintao, the Hui areas. And I'm just wondering if there's some sort of coordination between temple fairs and market days in Muslim towns.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem. Apparently Skinner, I was asking Mark Henderson, who was his RA, and Skinner passed away, so he's got all this data, like a lot of it was handwritten, and Mark has it, and so I was saying to Mark, well, I need the schedule of the market days for all the market towns that Skinner mapped in Han China. And then Mark was saying, well, apparently he wrote them by hand on all these maps. Like, this was the 8th day or the 2nd day, or the schedule of the Han market towns. And so it's a huge mess of just you gotta get these hard copy maps that Skinner wrote. But then there's a lot of Chinese scholars though. In the 1980s, apparently market towns was a popular subject for certain types of economic historians. So my guess is there's got to be some books in China that have great data for provinces that could be digitized, But no, that's another thing that would be fun to do, would be to take the schedule of the markets, because in the Chinese market towns, some of them were rotated.
Yeah.
They didn't necessarily have a market every day.
No,
Though
they always rotate.
Right, but in the bigger places, there probably was a bazaar where there were just traders set up every day, but not the smaller places.
Yeah. That would bring in the population. But it was generally also coordinated. So one day there would be market day here in this town, and then 50 kilometers away,
Right.
another market day.
Yeah.
So the merchants were selling certain goods.
Right.
Take their
Well,
goods,
well, that's what I
population.
want to do is with the monastery fair schedule, is use Skinner's methodology in the seminal Journal of Asian Studies article, Marketing and Social Structure of Rural China from the early 1960s. I wanted to take that methodology and say, no, I just have monastery fairs that have schedules instead, and try to map out those patterns. But Skinner in the early 60s, he didn't have GIS. So actually he had no actual quantitative, a lot of it was inference, of just inferring from the data, and then just sort of describing it textually. He never got to the point of being able to do this. So, there's so much work to do. Yeah.
Well, I asked Bill Skinner about why he calls the area where we were the periphery,
Yeah.
and there are other cores and other centers. This is the periphery. And he just said, basically, he really wasn't that interested. He was interested in Chinese society
Right.
because of the records and the density, but also he basically said population.
Yeah.
And he basically said, he has numbers of population density in the Chinese areas. And so you could have centers and it would be relative to the population. So what you're talking about, these monastic centers and those temple fairs, they might have been important to that community, but you're dealing with a much smaller scale of population than, say, a market day in Sichuan or something like that.
Right, where you're dealing
He's
with,
got the core, yeah.
you know, tens of thousands of people versus hundreds of.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, also, and Skinner was interested in the demographic structures, that when you get into these core areas, you really started to have different family structures from the peripheries. Whereas in, you know, these Tibetan and Mongol areas, you didn't really have, you had sort of the same demographic structure across the farmers and across the nomads. And you didn't have those massive demographic differences like you get in Han China. That's true too. Yeah.
Is it worth thinking about like periodicity to land use here? Because I mean, with this idea of kind of a certain autarky that you would have around a monastic fair, I mean, it's just absolutely intriguing. I'm thinking what you would have is a largely grazing economy, or primarily.
Farming and grazing.
Right, but probably you're going to have like more heavily grazed areas, and then you're going to have eventually a soil exhaustion, right? You're going to have pretty bad soil losses, especially on the slopes, right, from intensive grazing, which is then going to be prompting people to have to spend more hours and more time with greater toil associated with cropping, like a greater ratio of cropping, which is going to mean a very different, probably a different set of incentives with respect to longer distance trade. And so, you know, if you think about, say, the U.S. Western Hemisphere, right, we have, you know, grazing, which gives way to like a small, not very successful for a small scale cropping, which then gives way to larger yeoman farming and really does change